All right. I think most people are in, and I'm sure more people will join us. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Tory Eisenlohr-Moul. Hopefully I got that almost
No.
right. Mowell. Ah, right. Mowell. Uh, to give the talk today. I'm really excited. I actually even saw her first slide. I'm just even more excited now. Like you're all in for a treat. But before I introduce Dr. Eisenlohr-Moul, I want to give a land acknowledgement, and then my cursor will work. I know it will. There we go. I would like to acknowledge that we live, work, play, and participate in a community on the unceded, ceded, and traditional territories of the 630 First Nations, each of which possess their own unique traditions and history here on this land that we now refer to as Canada. I recognize that many of you are not from Canada, and I encourage you to understand the Indigenous peoples on the lands of which you now dwell. We acknowledge the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In all of our work, we are committed to ensuring Indigenous women's rights to health and safety and the equal opportunity to participate in a manner that recognizes and respects Indigenous cultures and traditions. Today, I'm joining from Toronto, which is covered by Toronto Purchase number 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is now home to a vast diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis who enrich the city. Many of our members live in Vancouver, which is part of the unceded homelands of the Coast Salish peoples and the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. So this is brought to you by the Women's Health Research Cluster, which was, I guess, founded in late 2018. We have over 950 members across, I think it's 41 countries now. We're very proud of that diversity that we have. We run a number of events, including the Women's Health Seminar Series that you have. Please, if you're not a member, please think about joining. It's free to join. We also have trainee travel awards that we give out twice a year, and that's available to anyone wherever you live in the world. It's not a ton of money because it's Canadian dollars, but sometimes every little bit helps. And we also have a blog and a podcast, so please take a look at that. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Eisenlohr-Moul can start sharing theirs. Tory is a tenured Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where she serves as Associate Director of Translational Research and Reproductive Psychiatry and the Associate Director of Medical Scientist Training Program. Ooh, that's the MD PhD program. That's very special and really great. They are a leading expert on hormone mood interactions. Dr. Eisenlohr-Moul has authored over 130 peer-reviewed publications. How is that possible? How old are you? You don't have to answer that question. That's amazing. 130 peer-reviewed publications and serves as a principal investigator on multiple NIH R-level funded grants focused on the role of ovarian hormones and emotional disorders. She's a fellow of the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research and an associate member of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Uh, they have led research investigating longitudinal modeling and mechanistic hormone trials to investigate why some individuals experience menstrual cycle-related changes in mood, substance use, and suicidality. In addition to her research, they are practicing clinicians specializing in treatment-resistant premenstrual disorders and have served as many years as the chair of the clinical advisory board for the International Association for Premenstrual Disorders. And as you know, I like to give out a fun fact. I will also say I've learned so much from reading the research, particularly around premenstrual dysphoric disorders, but also other things. The research is so interesting, so I know we're all in for a delight. But her fun fact is that they are a figure skating super fan, I will say, and attends several competitions a year, I think a year, yes, and went to the World Cup Championships in Montreal and got to see one of her favorite skaters win, I think, yes.
Set the current world record. Yeah.
Set the current world record.
Yeah.
And so my big question to you is, do you skate?
Very badly, occasionally for fun with my nephew, but
And
not in any kind of serious way.
no, no
No.
kind of figure
No,
skating.
I am not good. Although interestingly, one of my graduate students was on Team USA. So randomly,
You find each
happenstance, I
other. You
did
find
not,
each other.
it was not part of the selection criteria.
Can you imagine? Yes.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, very brilliant scientist, Jordan Baroni. But yeah, no, it's a good time.
Fantastic. Well,
Yeah,
we welcome you and thank you so much for agreeing to do this. And
yeah.
please feel free to take the stage.
All right, thanks everyone. So I'm gonna hop around a lot here, trying to get um, some some big ideas, while also some details shoved into this time. So there might be a tiny bit of whiplash here or there, but please feel free to ask questions if I lose you anywhere along the way. So, before I dive in, I just want to give a quick shout out to my current lab. So, we're really kind of pride ourselves in being clinician scientists. And, most of what we do, I think probably we couldn't do in a lab that wasn't a clinician and scientist lab, especially our suicide focused hormone work. So, that's really important to me. And it's important to me to glean the benefits of both people with a lot of expertise in behavioral phenotyping and clinical phenomenology. I think clinical psychology does that really well. I'm a clinical psychologist, but then also like all of what medicine and neuroscience has to offer. And I have some very specific expertise in that area, but lack some of the broad training of my colleagues. And so I have a wonderful co-I, MD, PhD, Melissa Wagner-Schumann, who's an exceptional psychiatrist and neuroscientist, and then 4 MD, PhD students, in addition to my clinical psychology trainees who tend to be sort of more advanced, residency onward, and kind of tend to be more junior faculty mentees. This integration is really important to me, and I think has been the key to a lot of our success. All right, just a little bit. I'm going to cruise through these since most of you here probably know them. Females are at greater risk of affective disorders, and this is, a huge cause of disability. And, depending on the disorder, the prevalence can be 3 to 1. There's also the same thing with suicidality. So men make more, actually die by suicide more frequently, and a lot of that probably has to do with their greater socialization and lethal means like firearms. But females make far more attempts, far more attempts, and spend way more time in suicidal ideation and planning and recovery states. It's the number one cause of hospitalization in females of reproductive age. For a while, it was the number two cause of death in females of reproductive age. It kind of comes and goes, but it's usually in the top five. So it's a huge problem. There's a lot of reasons that females might be at greater risk of affective symptoms and suicidality. There are certainly a large number of social and environmental causes that deserve study, but I am focused on the potential hormonal component. We do see greater risk around puberty, certain parts of the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, and menopause, where we see these elevations in risk sort of in the population as a whole, that give us the sense that these hormonal fluctuation times must be risky. On the other hand, if that were inherently the case, we would see, if we followed females through these transitions, we would see that everyone has these changes. And we just don't see that. There is kind of a large group of people who seem to have just about no symptoms going through these transitions. The menstrual cycle, pregnancy, menopause, really maybe I had a cramp at some point and decided to take an ibuprofen. Maybe I was a little lower energy than usual, right? This kind of thing. But, we're really not counting that. It's very, very mild things that really don't, you don't kind of think twice about them. They're not really distressing or impairing in any way. And then you have people with mild to moderate changes who maybe, in these transitions have some problems, depicting those sort of in the pink here, where, depending on how things go, maybe sometimes they have some distress and impairment and other times they don't. And then in the red, these are kind of our best estimates of people of the female population who have, really sort of diagnosable psychopathology that, as far as we can tell, is linked to that transition. And these estimates are rough because there's not enough work in this area, particularly longitudinal work. But it's really striking, right, that it isn't everyone that has these changes. And so, as important as the basic science is, as important as the general population science is to understand that, there are massive limitations to using that as a way to understand the pathophysiology and the problems that lead to these symptoms in these more severe cases. Because, for example, if you have 100 kind of randomly selected females off the street of Chicago, what they saw was about 5% of them, about 5 of them would have, changes that needed diagnosis. So, if you imagine that you recruit 30 people, what's 5% of 30? You might have a couple people in your sample, right? So you're really not asking the question that you want to be asking at that point. So where I come from is really a place of let's dig into this dimension, right? And really try to oversample folks who are at risk for these problems, and really understand what makes them different, not from men, although that's an interesting question, but what makes them different from the black squares, right? What makes them different from the people who don't have these symptoms despite having the same hormonal triggers, as far as we can tell. That is really the biggest sort of driving question for my research is what makes hormone sensitive females different from non-hormone sensitive females. The menstrual cycle is very, straightforward. Well, it's not straightforward. It's something probably most of you know what it looks like, but I'm going to show it here. The solid line is estrogen, get a peak right before ovulation, and then a secondary rise in the luteal phase between ovulation and menses. Progesterone is really quite low throughout the follicular phase and then prominent in the luteal phase. And then there's this drop. So there's this surge that happens, and then there's a drop off that happens. And really, I think particularly when it comes to PMS and PMDD, there's just, at least in America, and I think this is probably true in a lot of at least English-speaking countries, and I don't know beyond that, the cultural stereotypes really exaggerate the prevalence of meaningful PMS, right? We all know folks who have experienced it, and sometimes when you see it, especially if it's severe, it can be kind of memorable, right? But that, does not equate to everyone has it. And so that is an important thing to say. Because of this bias, for whatever reason, people, people tend to report that they have a lot of premenstrual symptoms. And then when we follow them prospectively and we have them do daily ratings, and we're still trying to understand this because we think that this might kind of depend on the symptom, and there might be, a lot more work we can do in this area to understand why there's this mismatch. But for the purposes of right now, recruiting and studying this, we have to use daily ratings for just about everything. We don't really, in this field, read or review retrospective cross-sectional reports of PMS or take that seriously as a grouping factor, because the chance of people having sort of prospective cyclicity when they reported that on the SCID, even something quite structured like the SCID or a single time point survey like the premenstrual symptom screening tool, you can get a slight enrichment of your sample that way, but you're still only going to see maybe 40% with like a clear cyclical pattern if you recruit in these ways on the left. So we really have to have these daily ratings still at this point. It's just tons of false positives otherwise. And again, I think that there's good reason to look into that further and understand what's happening there. I don't think it's like a simple, maybe there are some folks there who are having changes, but they're just different than what we're looking for, or, something like this. But for right now, there's so much uncertainty around all of that. We really have to have the daily ratings. The single codified diagnostic entity for menstrual cycle mood change is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It was added to the DSM-5 in 2013. The prevalence, like I said, is about 5-6%. That prevalence study was actually done in Chicago, and they sampled, well, it was done in Illinois. They oversampled sort of urban, rural, really tried to get good coverage across various demographic factors, and found about 5-6% had a really clear on-off pattern where their symptoms were as we need in PMDD, rising throughout the luteal phase, present in the week before menses to a distressing or impairing degree, and then a drop off into the follicular phase. And so both of these elements are important. It needs to we need to see the symptoms be present again to a distressing or impairing degree, and it has to include affective symptoms as one of the symptoms. And then this switch out is very important. So by the end of menses, the definition in PMDD really expects that symptoms are gone by the end of menses, and really truly gone, minimal, absent, not diagnosable as any kind of mental disorder at that point. These are the specific symptoms on the left. There's 11 symptoms. You need to have 5 that show that pattern in daily ratings to get the diagnosis, which is quite a high bar. And the amount of change required is sort of that's a little bit of a subjective thing, which I'll talk about later. But you need to see at least 5 symptoms kind of switching on and switching off. One of them has to be these emotional symptoms here. Gotta have 5 total. Have to confirm the pattern across 2 cycles of daily ratings. In practice, that often doesn't happen because logistically, even if you can collect them, scoring it is quite subjective and tricky. One thing I want to draw attention to is that there's this really big emphasis on it not being merely an exacerbation of another psychiatric disorder. And I'll just go ahead and put my flag around and say, I think this needs to go away. I think that merely an exacerbation is extremely vague. And I think what actually happens clinically, and I know what actually happens clinically for my patients, which is they start off with PMDD and they often come in with their mothers. I don't know why this, I think their mothers are still supporting them at, 35 or whatever. They come with their mothers are like, we've tried everything. It's so severe. And I say, when did it start? Well, it started as a teenager, it was just the severe PMDD. And now over the years being hit with this 1 week or even 2 weeks out of the month sometimes, and then having really severe behavioral problems where they're, sort of causing property damage or causing damage to relationships or, making suicide attempts. Not everyone has symptoms that severe, but it's a lot more like that than people realize. Like it tends to be pretty dysregulated emotional, impulsive behavior for a lot of folks. And we see that happen 1 to 2 weeks a month. And then she was like, well, eventually she just got really depressed because it just kept hitting her. Eventually, she just got really anxious about when it was going to hit again. Eventually, she started having panic attacks or an ovulation because she knew it was coming in. Right. So the cleanup that people have to do for a week and a half, the damage that's done, it's just really not realistic. And what we see is the more severe the premenstrual symptoms, the higher the baseline negative affect symptoms. So at that point, if we know that people with the most severe manifestations of this are by definition likely to develop those other psychiatric disorders, you can say, yeah, treat the other disorders. Sure, go ahead. But 9 times out of 10, in my experience, especially when you have severe PMDD, you've got to treat the cyclicity in order to treat the other disorder, right? The other disorder is so often what maintains the other the PMDD is so often what maintains the other disorder. So anyway, so I'll get off my soapbox about that. But I think that this is, there are some differences. There's some, very little work has been done to show that these are really different things. And so I think we need more work there. Okay. Different scoring methods. As I said, this how much change is enough question comes up a lot. I'm not going to go into all of the details here. But if you want to read, I have an American Journal of Psychiatry paper where we created something called the Carolina Premenstrual Assessment Scoring System, or the CPAS, that basically scores daily ratings for the purposes of things like clinical trials, where you really want to know that the sort of mathematical definition of change is similar across. And you can look at the paper if you want to see what these specific methods are, but just I kept the sort of different methods for calculating change on the left side here, and then across the top, different cut points like 30% change, 50% change, 75% change, right? And you can see that basically in the heat map here, it's the percentage of our about 100-person sample that met criteria for PMDD based on these different combinations of change calculation. And you can see that it goes from what 54% of the sample meeting criteria in one combination to 3% of the sample meeting. It's just really matters how you do this, and it's really subjective. And this is something that the field is still grappling with and trying to figure out what to do. We suggested a certain combination of things and created an R package called CPAS that does implement it with daily ratings. But we need to do so much more to figure out, how can we identify people with changes without being too rigid, but also have it mean something, right? And have it mean something across labs. So this is an area. The CPAS is what we use to diagnose PMDD in our clinic, but other people find it a little too stringent. Okay, here's the American Journal of Psychiatry paper from back in 2017. You can check that out. Other soapbox things. DSM-5 excludes those with subthreshold cyclicity. So what if you have moderate premenstrual changes on top of another psychiatric disorder, right, that really take you from bad to worse every month? That cannot be addressed in our current framework. So, basically you have to meet this specific threshold or you just are sort of deemed to not have it. And so we need some way of capturing severity, I think. As I said, basically we're excluding the most severe patients right now from diagnosis. And I recognize that there are complicated reasons for that, but I really think it was done to sort of to please. I think it was done. I suspect it was done as a little bit of a compromise, but I don't think it's working because, again, we see people more like this blue shape and we can't diagnose them, and it's a problem. Okay, the only group that we really have prevalence data, the only diagnosis we really have prevalence data for premenstrual exacerbation is major depressive disorder. And when they did that, same cohort in Chicago, added people with depressive disorders, followed them across multiple cycles. It was about 50 to 60, 50, I think it was 58%, but we've seen similar things in our samples when we recruit for suicidality. About 60% with the same degree of change that we would expect to see in PMDD, but with an elevated baseline. So again, if 60%, major depression is probably most common, I think it is the most common diagnosis in females, 60% of those patients are experiencing essentially PMDD, but we can't diagnose them. That's a huge problem. Premenstrual exacerbation is transdiagnostic. It's common. So when I got to the field, there was already evidence, for MDD, for that some people with bipolar were experiencing both depressed and manic exacerbations. Certainly some evidence in bulimia that there is a hormone-sensitive subtype there that's really common. Some work in anxiety and fear disorders. Then when I got to the field, we added some additional longitudinal work in this area. So we've shown in borderline PD, it's also about 60 to 70%. So people with really severe emotion dysregulation, frequently have a lot of that sort of irritable, anger, rejection sensitive, kind of interpersonal emotional stuff happening for them that really seems to exacerbate their impairment. We see changes in ADHD symptoms, again, in a subset, not in everybody, but in a subset. Alcohol use, marijuana use across multiple samples, we see that, and then suicidal thoughts and behaviors. But it's not present in all females with a given disorder or symptom. So it's not as though you can say, oh, this is a female with depression sitting in front of me, and so they must have a menstrual cycle effect on their symptoms. No, because 40% of them really kind of don't. So it's this separate thing. It's this transdiagnostic risk of does the cycle, and I really believe that is one of the main drivers of female biased risk for psychopathology is not that, oh, everybody has this elevated risk because they're female, but that a certain subset has this hormone-driven elevated risk. And to the extent that we're just looking at all females, we're going to miss it. Okay, DSM-5, this is the really the point of this talk. DSM-5 ignores unique trajectories. So we have seen over and over again, and I'll show you in a second, a couple of really distinguishable trajectories of negative affect across the luteal and perimenstrual phases. So we see, this is just a cartoon of what we see. We see this luteal onset, and it's not always a square wave like that. Sometimes often it sort of inches up over time. And this is really like a typical PMDD thing in the purple, right? This is this, you know, uh, rise and sustained symptoms, and it drops off really rapidly with the onset of menses, right? This purple person would meet PMDD criteria 100% of the time. But then we also see, particularly in our depressed and suicidal and ADHD and other sort of vulnerable population subgroups, we see this subgroup of people or group of people who, in addition, sometimes it's both, have this spike at menses. And it's really, it's a few days before menses, usually through menses, and it usually often takes them almost until ovulation. It can take them almost until ovulation to recover. So these people, if you calculate the typical premenstrual, postmenstrual metrics on them, they actually look opposite. They actually look like they're having premenstrual benefit and postmenstrual, right? Even though this is really perimenstrual worsening, right? So I think this is a huge issue and maybe part of the reason that we're not getting consistency when folks self-report their symptoms. So we see this a lot, and we see that it's even sometimes more common than the luteal pattern. So I think, this is a thing that I've seen since postdoc, and got curious about it, and then we keep seeing it. So this is an old paper that I did with some German data in people who had been diagnosed with PMDD, actually, by just sort of a clinician looking at daily ratings. And you can see there is this subgroup of people in the diamonds there who, there's why can't I point? Pointer. There's a subgroup of people who, have this, is this going to do it? Oh, no. There's a subgroup of people who, can you see my pointer? Oh, okay, good, thank you. So we've got in the black circles, we have this sort of luteal phase group, right? And then it drops off. And then in the diamonds, we have this group that, there's something luteal happening, but then in addition, they really seem to have risk concentrated at the start of menses, and it takes a while to clear out. And we see that over and over again. And then often there's this sort of slightly milder group that maybe is a little bit of a mix of the two. So these are not necessarily groups of people, but I think they tell us about the kinds of sensitivities that are common in this population. Here it is in female patients with ADHD. So there's a little fancier methods here, but these are preliminary. But you can see in an R01 that we just did, this is about, I think this is maybe a subgroup analysis, but they all look basically like this, where we have this luteal phase group here, and then we have this menstrual group. And sometimes the luteal phase group is more severe, and sometimes the perimenstrual group is more severe, and it just depends. Here it is these are all like preliminary. We're just working on these manuscripts right now. This is in about 150 females recruited for suicidality in the past month. We see the same groups. And note that, there is a flat group, right? There's a group that is not experiencing that. I mean, we recruited them for suicidality. You really cannot get like more severity. This is recruited for ADHD diagnosis. Still flat group, right? There are these flat groups that just don't, if you look in PMDD, everybody has cyclicity, right? There's no flat group. If you look in the psychopathology groups, you get these subgroups. And, so one thing we're looking at is, pooling all of our samples together to kind of get a bigger sample so we can have better confidence around these mixture models. But, what we've seen so far in the larger data sets has replicated this. And it really seems to be that when it comes to negative affect, there's this luteal sensitivity that can occur, and then there's this menstrual sensitivity. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to speed up a little bit because this is less central, but we do have a new method that we've developed for scaling menstrual cycle time. So forward count has some problems. You can see the blue is the intensity, the level of estrogen, and the red intensity is the level of progesterone. You can see if you do forward count, these different cycle lengths, all the hormone levels are misaligned. If you do backward count from next menses onset, we can align the progesterone pretty well, but this lacks some alignment, right? And so what we've developed is a method that scales both of the phases based on menses and ovulation dates. So you have basically 0 to 100 here and then 0 to 100 here. And that gives us a timeline that we were able to show it minimizes the variability in daily hormone levels. So we had urinary hormones. You can see here, there's a nice tight standard error for estrogen levels when we do this scaling. And when we do forward and backward count, you can see that it's really messy. The estrogen levels in here are really messy. And I'm really sad to tell you that this is the mid-follicular phase, which we all use as our baseline when everyone should be the same with respect to their hormone symptoms. Unfortunately, that is not the case if you're doing it forward count. If you do it with the scaling, then that works. So this blue is the statistically significant differences between the two. So you can see when you do this scaling, you really do get a much more valid, continuous underlying timeline that you can then fit nonlinear splines to and a lot of cool stuff. And this is what those nonlinear splines look like. You can see ovulation is sort of 0, menses onset's 100. So we've got this scaling happening, and this reduces the concern that these subgroups are due to different hormone dynamics due to timing differences. Okay. This menstrual cycle R package is designed to carry out the phase-aligned cycle time scaling I talked about, but we're also going to add a bunch of other things. We're going to add the pipelines for the generalized additive mixed models, those smooth curves, the smoothing mixture models. We have plans to sort of flesh it all out so that there can be one pipeline that you just kind of press play and you get pretty graphs and can understand your effects and the heterogeneity in your effects. Briefly, hospitalization for suicidality peaks perimenstrually. We see, suicidality across the cycle really, it was cross-sectional, a lot of this work. This is the cartoon showing results of a review, or it's a number of studies suggesting increased risk for suicide attempts. So the rigor here with the cross-sectional hospitalization and suicide attempt data was, middling, just because, it's hard to follow people prospectively and find out when they make a suicide attempt, but I think pretty convincing overall. Then in PMDD, we found that when you survey folks with PMDD who have received a diagnosis from a doctor with daily ratings, not their own daily evaluation of daily ratings, but we put those people out, people who say, not only did I see a pattern, my doctor saw it and diagnosed me. We see most of them report passive suicidal ideation, regardless of whether they've been diagnosed with another psychiatric comorbidity. Suicide attempts, about a third have made a suicide attempt lifetime, they tell us, and then about half non-suicidal self-injury. And in the red and the gray, you can see red is if they report an additional psychiatric diagnosis, which this is not a perfect measurement, but it's 600 people across the globe. So it's I think, pretty startling view of the association between cyclical mood change and suicidality. And then by the same token, if we recruit for PMDD, we get suicidality. If we recruit for suicidality, don't talk about the menstrual cycle in our ads. Don't say, are you a woman? Don't say, right, we want to understand the biology of suicidal thoughts. This is what we get. This is 129 people recruited for suicidality, natural cycling. We see, on average, this perimenstrual worsening of their suicidality prospectively across the cycle. So this is what those hospital sort of snapshot studies couldn't show, that there is actually a prospective process of worsening. And as we're now in the process of looking at the mixture models to see what the subtypes look like. And it really is, we see one subtype that looks like this and another subtype that looks like this, and then others that are flat. So this is an oversimplification, and there are certainly a lot of people in this group who do not have those cyclical changes. And the only thing that distinguishes them seems to be their cyclicity. It's not associated with demographics. It's not a, it really seems to be this just biological factor of hormone sensitivity. All right. Quickly, this hormone sensitivity seems to occur in the absence of any kind of abnormal hormone levels, ratios. Occasionally somebody will find something, but the experimental studies tell us that you can manipulate the hormone levels and keep them the same between controls and people with cyclicity. And it really is the change itself, the normal change itself, that triggers their symptoms. And they metabolize the hormones normally in studies looking at that. It really seems to be this abnormal sensitivity. And many patients find this disappointing, right? Because if it's not in their ovaries, it's in their brain, and that is upsetting. So we created this dimensional affective sensitivity to hormones framework to try to get at this hormone sensitivity and the differences that we see across populations. So, we do see in the premenstrual dysphoric disorder literature a lot of evidence that it's the allo surge that causes problems. I'll probably fast forward through some of those slides in the interest of time, but basically there's really good data, experimental data from Peter Schmidt, David Rubineau at NIH that, you can flatten this out and get rid of symptoms. You can add back hormones, estrogen or progesterone, you can trigger symptoms, but not in controls, only in patients. My lab has added this second possibility that we think, so you remember that purple group that's like this? We think that that's probably the allosurge group. My lab has really focused on this second group that is menstrually worsening, which, by the way, can co-occur with this and does often. You'll see irritability like this and depression like this. So my lab has really focused on the role of estrogen withdrawal, and we have some experimental data suggesting that it is estrogen withdrawal there that's, part of the problem, sensitivity to estrogen withdrawal. And then there's a third sensitivity that I'm going to just briefly touch on at the end, that is maladaptive risk-taking with the surge of estrogen. Again, we don't see it in everyone, but I've had a lot of patients where the impulsivity shows up in a big way there and then sort of sets them up for other problems. So this is our dimensional affective sensitivity to hormones, or DASH framework. This was just published in Molecular Psychiatry. I encourage you to check it out. We review all of the experimental evidence for these different kinds of sensitivities, and it's a work in progress. Like, it needs to be updated, but we felt it was important to stop and say, okay, case control PMDD studies are nice, but what if PMDD isn't one thing? Because it increasingly looks like it's not one thing. So maybe we need to step back and think about, what is the hormonal trigger that this person is responding to? All right, so as I said, I'm gonna blow through this a little bit so we have time for questions, but this is, Peter Schmidt's work on, surges. They've done this work. Basically, you can get rid of the symptoms, as I said, and hormone add back, the symptoms come back, and then in the second month of hormone add back, they go away. So it really is sensitivity to the surge, not the high level. And we see this in pregnancy too, during GnRHA add back protocols. People with a history of peripartum mood have this sort of immediate, when we first add back hormones, they have this very high arousal negative affect response, and it is that sort of luteal phase PMS stuff, right? Anger, irritability, overwhelm, anxiety, like high distress kind of stuff. And so we think that this is, an extension of that. And there's a good experimental evidence that if you block this pathway in patients with PMDD who've been selected to have that luteal phase phenotype, you can prevent the symptoms. And this is fascinating because analogs are used as treatments for other reproductive mood disorders. So this really suggests the complexity of, what works in postpartum might actually be the trigger in PMDD, right? And so often people sort of assume that this is all the same thing, and I really don't think it is. Luteal serotonergic function also plays a big role in that. But is this the full story? So we're interested in this secondary perimenstrual onset story. Is it steroid withdrawal? So there are treatments that induce a steroid withdrawal state. To some extent, combined oral contraceptives endogenously produce that. GnRHA, or chemical menopause, induces a low kind of menopausal ovarian shutdown. And a lot of these reliably cause changes in depressed mood, especially when depression is chronic. And so, in animals, we see withdrawal from estrogen, progesterone, or allo triggering these things. Estrogen withdrawal, we know, has something to do with perimenopausal onset depression. There's some good experimental evidence for that. And so why not the menstrual cycle? Nobody's tested it. Nobody's looked to see if we stabilize estrogen and progesterone, like what happens. Aside from like long-term just progesterone studies, which I think are a little bit different. So here we recruited 30 naturally cycling females with past month suicidality. 73% of them had a history of suicide attempt. We did not select for any kind of PMS, PMDD. In fact, we worked hard to, obviously there's a little bit of womanly female branding, which we've started to get rid of for a variety of reasons, but we really tried to like keep them in the dark about that aspect of the study until the very last minute when they're signing the consent form and they see all of it. So keep that in mind. They did daily surveys throughout, and then here's the experimental design. So in the placebo condition, you can see we're going to allow after the LH confirmation, we're going to start 7 days after with a placebo patch and pill, and we can see their estrogen and progesterone is going to drop normally there. So that's the sort of, we expect things to be bad there, right? More worsening. And then in the active estrogen and progesterone condition, during this gray part, instead of a placebo, they're getting active transdermal estradiol and oral micronized progesterone in sort of moderate doses. We had pretty good retention in this one. And what you can see is under withdrawal, we get this worsening pattern. When we prevent it, the withdrawal, we prevent the worsening pattern. This is all within person because it's a crossover design. So everybody got both conditions. And then when we pull them off, we see a little bit of a recapitulation, although this doesn't happen for everyone. But some people are so sensitive that when we pull them off the patches, we see that we sort of shift this here, right? So we sort of prevent exogenous change, prevent endogenous change, create exogenous change. And we can see these symptoms. This is really specific to suicidality, depression, hopelessness, feeling stressed, and interpersonal sensitivity. Did nothing to anger, irritability, or impulsivity. So those classic PMS symptoms, not affected by this, which I think is kind of cool. That's the luteal stuff, right? It's really specific to the hormone withdrawal days. In the second clinical trial, again, same deal, new sample, 44 naturally cycling females. This happened during COVID, and it was a 3-period crossover. So we had a lot of attrition, but we had enough completers to look at the 3 conditions, which were placebo, which is that withdrawal, natural withdrawal, estrogen alone with placebo pills, or progesterone alone with a placebo patch. So now we're trying to say, is it estrogen or is it progesterone? Way less retention here because COVID hit in the middle of it. So, we did our best. We did have 23 people complete all 3, which is not bad for a 3-period crossover. And we can see that overall suicidal ideation was a little less prominent to see, but you can see for depression, it's really clear in this menstrual phase where it really is estrogen driving the benefit. And it has a greater benefit, of course, for people who have that withdrawal sensitivity, which we haven't selected for. But when we go back and look at those shapes, we see it helps people more who have the perimenstrual pattern, in case you're wondering. And rejection sensitivity also maybe even precedes that in the perimenstrual phase. Again, in yellow, with estrogen just prevents that. No effect on anger, irritability, or impulsivity, again. So and you can see the pattern here is following that sort of luteal shape, right? So I think this suggests, I think that the specific hormones can trigger symptoms in a lot of different ways. And this is not to say that somebody couldn't be irritable during menses or somebody couldn't be depressed during luteal phase. Like, of course they are, and that happens. But I think that there's a signal there around what is sort of the most common sort of impairing or driving elements. And I think that we just see more of this kind of high arousal, negative affect, interpersonal problems, etc., mood swings premenstrually. And then we see more of this depressive brain fog. One thing I forgot to add here is that we also show a similar beneficial effect of estrogen on the NBAC. So working memory basically shows a similar pattern. We have NBAC here, here, and here. I'm sorry, I forgot to add this. And basically, performance declines under placebo, and we can prevent that with the estrogens. Progesterone doesn't do anything. So I think that there's a cognitive element potentially here as well, which the DASH proposes. In my first R1, which we just completed, this is like a very bad preliminary data picture. It's so fuzzy. I don't know what happened. It was so beautiful. But this is just a hot off the press, very messy. We get the same pattern, basically. This is a particularly pretty one, but we get the same. This one is sorry, going back to that first design with estrogen progesterone versus placebo. We get the same result in a much larger 90-person sample that we brought in more frequently, and we have a lot of biomarkers that we are sorting through from this. But we basically replicated it now 3 times, which I think is notable. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying that estrogen withdrawal is what matters and luteal progesterone surges don't. I'm saying they're both different triggers, and people vary in how sensitive they are to them. And it does appear that when you recruit for suicidality and all of the transdiagnostic psychopathology that comes along with it, you get a lot of people who are withdrawal sensitive. You also get a lot of people with the luteal phase pattern. We just haven't really focused on that here, right? And you also notably see a lot of people with both. And if somebody has then basically 3 weeks of symptoms, they're going to get a borderline personality disorder diagnosis if it's severe, right? So you can see how merely an exacerbation is really doing a lot of heavy lifting there that could have a lot of problems. All right. This is also another hot off the press last little thing I'll show, where in the second study where we separated estrogen and progesterone, and this was true in the first study too, when we give progesterone in any condition, we massively increase progesterone levels, allopregnanolone levels. So there's this first pass metabolism of the oral micronized progesterone to allo, and we see this sort of sustained elevated allo levels, across the experimental period. And it doesn't really seem to matter. Like, some people go up here, a lot of people don't. A lot of people kind of stay here, depending on the person. It doesn't really seem to matter. We have people who have really negative reactions to the progesterone at this level. We have people who have really negative reactions at this level. So there seems to be an increase in allo, and that progesterone stabilization did nothing. It did not improve symptoms. And in fact, for a subset of people, maybe 5 or 6 people in the sample who probably have PMDD, had really severe reactions, and we had to monitor them really closely, and in some cases discontinue and just carry forward their last observation. So estrogen in the yellow is not increasing allo, and yet it is benefiting symptoms, right? So I think we are not looking at at an allopregnanolone drop off here. I think we're looking at an estrogen drop off effect. Okay. So this is kind of the model. I'm going to really quickly say, there's this reward hypersensitivity phenotype as well. We see alcohol drinking at ovulation in addition to menses. We see this in several data sets. We see, especially on the weekends, both perimenstrual and periovulatory drinking is heightened. And, so we think that this periovulatory impulsivity phenotype could be part of that. We see in day-to-day that at low progesterone levels and spiking estrogen, so that would be basically ovulation, right? That is where you get your increased probability of binge drinking day-to-day on the weekend. So I think that there's evidence that this is a surge sensitivity that kind of makes some people impulsive. We also see greater inhibition failures under alcohol during a high estrogen state, like a late follicular state relative to early follicular. So there's something going on there. All right. So we think there are some subtypes, and we think we need to focus on those, and we need to pull those out across the lifespan instead of talking about perinatal and PMDD and perimenopause. Maybe we need to be saying, okay, forget about all that. Who's progesterone surge sensitive, right? Can we create a biological marker of that? Because that feels more useful. And how sensitive, right? Because these are not yes, no things, right? These are dimensional. And We also need to make sure that these are stable. We think they are from our data and our clinical work, but we need more longitudinal data on that. And obviously just lots and lots of evidence around, are these useful groups clinically? So this is early days on this, but I think it may help us understand why we get a lot of false positives and why we get, a lot of failed trials in PMDD. All right. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, yes, thank you for your little icons because it's always hard giving virtual talks. I'm super hopeful that we'll be able to invite Dr. Tory Eisenlohr-Moul,
Well,
and I'll figure out how
good
to
try.
say her name
Ooh,
name properly as by then
no
in
worries.
person for the Toronto people at least. Don't worry, we'll advertise this heavily when this does occur. But that was really fantastic. I told you, everyone, that you would learn something, and I hope that you did learn a lot. I had to stop. I was whatever blue skying, not tweeting, posting, and then I had to stop to like really listen. And then my cat was trying to understand too. Um, but I really appreciate it because also because you touched upon, and so I know there was a question also in the chat, which we'll get to in a second. It was
I
from
saw
one of
it. Yeah.
did you see it?
It's
So
basically, so I'll answer it
yeah,
really quickly,
yeah,
which is
sure.
that everything I showed was negative affect.
Mm,
So just sort of those first 8 items of the DRSP, just negative affect in ADHD. They have a lot of comorbidities. Negative affect in people recruited for suicidality, negative affect. So the same items. I kind of threw that together quickly just to show like the latest data, but
that
but
was
we
super
see
cool.
similar subtypes in some of the self-reported like attentional and impulsivity stuff in the ADHD group. So stay tuned. That paper is going to go out for review in a couple of weeks, and I think it suggests that there's a lot of affective input and that the cognitive changes have something to do with the estrogen withdrawal subtype. I'll just put it.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I should always give the floor to the audience. So if there are other questions, please either put them in the chat or raise your hand and we will get to you. I'm trying to make sure that I don't miss anyone. So please let me know. Oh, we have one raised hand who is raised hand, or is that me? No, Justin, please.
Yes, I have a question. I
Good.
thank you, Tori. That was a great talk.
It
We've
was
been trying to
fantastic.
get some work going at CAMH, looking at menstrual cycle changes in responses to cannabis. And we're having trouble convincing reviewers of the clinical significance of this work. So I just wanted to get your input. Do you see any like changes across menstrual cycle in cannabis use specifically clinically? And do you have any data that speak to that as well?
I
Thank
have,
you.
yeah, so I have I have a grant on that exact topic. And we are seeing changes. So I'm happy to
Good.
share that preliminary data, with you.
You
Yeah,
can
that would be
trust
great.
Justin. You can
Thank
trust
you.
Justin.
Oh yeah,
But
I'm very like, I should be so lucky that like people want to like steal this and use it. No
no,
one works in this area, right? So
I,
yeah, no, we
I
definitely like we have 2 studies focused on that question right now that my student Anna Patterson is doing with Rachel Tomko at MUSC in South Carolina. They have a couple of grants focused on that. So there are data coming on
come.
that specific question, and it looks like
Great.
there are subgroups, not surprisingly. So.
But to Justin's point, do you ever get, never, I'm sure, kind of feedback from your grant proposals that this is a fruitless task to look at menstrual cycle changes and that it's not an important thing to, you don't get that. I think the NIH is further ahead in some ways.
Well,
And
I mean, so I'm a reviewer and like I'm
yes, of course,
on
yeah, same.
so like
Yeah,
I would never say that,
no,
obviously. And I would probably be most likely, yeah, that would probably be the most likely person. Um, but then when people are recruited because of conflict to then review my grants, I think they're recruited specifically for their expertise in that area. So,
yeah,
oh, I guess I would say probably not right now, but I don't know what it's been like in the past.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
I
this,
think the main thing is you really have to hit hard this idea. I was somebody that was like, stop talking about PMS like all women
habit.
have it in a way that is a problem, right? Like, or have it at all. Like,
Mhm.
this is made up, right? And then obviously studied. I'm like, oh no, like there's severely impaired folks, right? And then there's the rest of us who want to be left alone, right? And so I really think that reviewers won't say that, like, oh, you've pissed me off as a menstruating person, right? But I really suspect you have to hit hard this idea of,
Not
instead of
everyone.
assuming this has happened for everyone, we need to understand for whom it might be happening. We know that
It's not everyone.
psychopathology is associated with cannabis use, right? We know that psychopathology is associated with higher risk of hormone sensitivity, right? So there is this reason to think that it could be part of why it's harder for females to quit, etc.
I have other things to say, but we don't have that much time. I wanted to touch upon anything. Oh, Laura, have you done any, Laura, did you want to ask? It says, have you done any imaging studies guiding with
Now,
guidance from your DASH framework? Soon,
let's
maybe.
just say there are multiple proposals in the hopper, and if our government ever reopens,
Happens, right?
I'll get, and I have some revised grants under review, but that is where we're headed, is
Yeah.
combining this with imaging and trying to select people at baseline based on some hormone mood correlations and
Mhm.
lagged correlations that we
Mhm.
think we have reason to think will help us select those estrogen withdrawal sensitive people more
Mhm.
specifically.
Fantastic. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Laura. There's amazing, sounds really promising. Great talk.
I am not
Uh,
an imager, so this will be collaborative, but yeah.
oh no, it's going to be fantastic. So one of the last sort of points, if there's no more questions that I wanted to sort of underscore that you did beautifully was a fact that so often I'll say talk about the overgeneralization of I mean, I think this is true about true for many points in science, but I often talk about women's health specifically. Like we say things like hormone therapy when there are many, and menopause when there are many, and same thing with even perinatal depression. There are many different kinds of trajectories, but that's also true for PMDD as well, or PME. And so I often now talk about your work and the fact that allopregnanolone can be beneficial in one circumstance, but not in all circumstances. I think that's a
Yeah.
really important piece
So
of
I think
information.
increasingly we're kind of headed toward this idea of stability being maybe
Hmm.
the answer for everyone, right? Can we
Hmm.
just get
Hmm.
it? Can we figure out a way? I have a friend who has diabetes. Just like we just need like an insulin pump
For,
or
for
aloe that will just keep it perfectly stable. Like sounds like a great invention. Go for it.
go do it. Go forth.
Yeah, go. Yeah, right. Yeah.
But so I really appreciate that we have different people that have these different kinds of profiles with sensitivities at different points. I really love the packs. I think it was called, right?
Check out
And
our package.
yeah, that's great. I did post on Blue Sky. I have a couple more posts to make before this closes, but I was trying to listen intently while my cat was jumping around. Um, but we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. We are now officially out of time, and I look forward to hearing more about your amazing work. So thank you
Thank
for
you so
doing
much. Thanks
it.
everybody for coming. Yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or need something.
That's
Bye.
fantastic. Bye. All right. I think most people are in, and I'm sure more people will join us. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Tory Eisenlohr-Moul. Hopefully I got that almost
Mel.
right. Mowell. Ah, right. Mowell. uh, to, to give the talk today. I'm really excited. I actually even saw her first slide. I'm just even more excited now. Like you're all in for a treat. But before I introduce Dr. Eisenlohr-Moul, I want to give a land acknowledgement, and then my cursor will work. I know it will. There we go. I would like to acknowledge that we live, work, play, and participate in a community on the unceded, ceded, and traditional territories of the 630 First Nations, each of which possess their own unique traditions and history here on this land that we now refer to as Canada. I recognize that many of you are not from Canada, and I encourage you to understand the Indigenous peoples on the lands of which you now dwell. We acknowledge the importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In all of our work, we are committed to ensuring Indigenous women's rights to health and safety and the equal opportunity to participate in a manner that recognizes and respects Indigenous cultures and traditions. Today, I'm joining from Toronto, which is covered by Toronto Purchase number 13, with